we can get out of any crisis without using taxpayers' money and without reducing public welfare spending as a result and austerity, because we can just use the reality of bank accounting to get cleanly out of any banking crisis. And this is also what central banks have done in the past when they didn't want a banking crisis to turn into a major recession. They just solved the problem like this. You can do it in one morning and you will not have a real banking crisis and you will not have a recession. This is what Ben Bernanke did in 2008. And he was actually, I proposed all these things in the 90s in Japan in these big debates we had where I also proposed quantitative easing. And Bernanke was joining these debates. And he was in 2008 the only central banker to implement my advice, the true quantitative easing, because the others slightly changed the definition. Step one, you have a bust banking system. The capital and the Basel approach is not enough. You know, it's this tiny amount anyway. And when the banks create money, use it for financial transactions, push up asset prices by 300–400%, which is due to banks creating this money for financial transactions. At the peak, if then asset prices drop by 10%, you've used up all the equity for the non-performing loans already. You're bust. So that's why we have the banking crises. So how do you get out of this quickly at no cost to the taxpayer? It's very simple. The central bank steps in, goes to the banks and says, oh, you've got non-performing assets larger than your equity, you're bust, all of you, bust banking system, always the same story. No problem, because we don't want a banking crisis now turning into a big recession. We will let you off this time. We will put in place measures to prevent this in the future. We'll talk about what those are, but we'll get you out of this one now. And you don't use tax money. That's expensive. That increases national debt. Ireland was a fiscal poster boy, but because the ECB forced it to fiscalize all the banking non-performing assets, Ireland became bankrupt, had to call in the IMF. No, we don't do that. The central bank steps in, goes to the banks and purchases the non-performing assets at face value. And the problem is solved. There's no cost. And this is exactly what Bernanke did. That's why in September, October 2008, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve quadrupled in 1 month. This doesn't create inflation. Some people thought at the time, wow, we're going to get hyperinflation now. They're inflating their way out. No. If you want to create inflation, some countries try to do this allegedly, like Japan for 20 years. It's not going to work with this method because it doesn't create money, because you're just shifting assets between the central bank and the banks in the right way, away from the bank balance sheets where they are harmful to the central bank, where they can't do any harm. But you don't inject money into the non-banking sector, so you can't create inflation. Oh, but hang on, the dollar is going to collapse. Well, no, as I said at the time, and it's strengthened. Why? Because you're not creating money, you're solving the problem in the banking system. The banks are healthy again, have strong balance sheets, and can lend again. And they did in America. It's the first country to get out of the crisis. Since then, very strong bank credit growth. Unfortunately, too much. That's why we're back in the same spot. They continue to create credit for financial transactions. That's how you prevent getting into this situation in the first place of banks being unstable. Because banks create money, you have to split the stream of credit creation from banks into two, for the real economy and for financial transactions, because they're not part of the real economy. And if banks create credit for financial transactions, you are creating an asset bubble, which is always unsustainable and will always lead to a banking crisis ultimately, if it's large enough. So in the early 2000s, I was warning that in Europe, the ECB, which is newly created, was going to create bank credit-driven asset bubbles, banking crises, unemployment, large recessions in the Eurozone. And that's exactly what they did in Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, based on 30% credit growth for how many years? 3-4 years. Way ahead of GDP growth. This is all credit creation by banks for asset transactions, property, real estate. That's how you blow up these countries, and that's what the ECB did.